Let's talk about federal bureaucracies, our so-called fourth branch of government. So pause and take a moment here to consider, what do you think when you hear the term bureaucrat? Do you feel positive or negative emotions surrounding this term? Have you come across this? Do you even know what a bureaucrat is? What kind of adjectives come up when you hear bureaucrat? A bureaucrat is another term for a government worker. A lot of times we hear jokes about inefficient government workers, that they're lazy, nothing gets done. These are certain adjectives or descriptors that we often hear about bureaucrats. It's usually negative and not particularly positive, and we'll go into why that might be here in a sec, or at least to at the very least to understand what the federal bureaucracy does and who's all in it. So again, the federal bureaucracy is the so-called fourth branch of government. First branch would be the Congress or the legislative branch. Second branch is the executive branch or the presidency. And third, the Supreme Court or the judiciary. And the fourth branch is the federal bureaucracy. It's not technically a branch, but it's grown so much in power over the years and influence that it effectively is almost its own branch of government at this point. The reality, though, is that it's really an extension of the executive branch. The federal bureaucracy functions under the umbrella of the executive branch. There aren't powers granted to the federal bureaucracy in the Constitution. Nothing's really granted under Article 1 or 2. It's something that has sort of begun to exist under the powers of the executive branch. So how many members do we have in Congress? We have 535 people total in Congress. How many members of the executive branch? About 17. We count the heads of the bureaucratic departments, plus the vice president and the president. So it's about 17 members. But how many members are in the bureaucracy? Well, there's pushing 3 million bureaucrats in the federal bureaucracy. In all of these departments, we have 15 departments that the heads of those departments are part of the executive branch, and within those departments are all of these bureaucrats, and there are other independent agencies and regulatory agencies as well that employ millions of people. So one branch of government has 535 members, another branch has about 17, give or take. You could increase that number to include the staff, the executive staff as well. And then we look at the bureaucracy, and it's this huge, absolutely huge number of people. So the federal bureaucracy, it's another term for governmental agencies. When we hear bureaucracy, that actually just means all of these government agencies and departments that we see. So there's 15 departments with numerous agencies within those departments and independent agencies as well. And bureaucrats, or the federal bureaucracy, we can look at them as problem solvers. They seek to solve a lot of social and economic problems that we have, or they actually implement the policies that our government, that our Congress and president enact themselves. So they're the implementation. They oversee and do the implementation of these policies and seek to solve certain social and economic problems, as well as different departments and agencies that look into the security of the nation as a whole. So the military, that's a bureaucracy, that's a bureaucratic department, actually within the U.S. government. It's the Department of Homeland Security as well. So that's when we look at the National Security Agency. This is a bureaucratic agency. So the bureaucracy, the two main functions that they have is problem solvers and implementers of policy devoted to helping with social and economic issues, Social Security, for example, things of that sort, unemployment. And on the, unemployment is, that's usually falls under the umbrella of state bureaucracy, but it's still another sort of bureaucratic department. And then the other function of the bureaucracy is primarily security, national security and defense. So it ends up being this sort of surveillance that happens. We see that with the FBI, the NSA, and other agencies of that sort. So here we have the picture of the executive branch. These are the members of the executive branch, this amount of people. But we could expand it to looking like this many people if we include the entire federal bureaucracy. That's more closely representative of how many people are within this branch of government. So it's really up to you to decide if the federal bureaucracy is its own branch of government or if it's part of the executive branch. Technically, there are still only 3 branches of government, and the federal bureaucracy falls under the executive branch, but you could make the argument that the federal bureaucracy has so much power that it functions as its own branch as well. So where does the term bureaucracy come from? So it really means rule of the desk or rule by the desk, and it comes from Greek. So it's government by bureaus. A bureau, this is a desk. This is a word for desk. And what we see then is all this administrative work that's done. So if you picture a bureaucracy, often people picture an office or some building that is full of desks and tons of paper, and it's sort of inefficient. That's the view of it, but it's this governance done by administration in a way. Rule of the desk. Well, what does the federal bureaucracy do? I'll read this quote here because I think it outlines it pretty well. So most people think that bureaucrats only follow orders. Of course, anyone who works in the executive branch is there to implement decisions, but the reality of their work is more complicated. The power of the bureaucracy depends on how much discretionary authority they have. Congress passes laws, but they cannot follow through on all the little decisions that have to be made as laws are translated into action. Bureaucrats then make policies and choose actions that are not spelled out in advance by laws. So in other words, the Congress passes laws, or maybe the president enacts an executive order, and bureaucrats in these various agencies are the ones that have to put those laws or orders or mandates or policies into action. And each bureaucracy or each department, each governmental department, has its own set of rules and procedures for how it does that. Their main function is to do the nuts and bolts of executing policies that are made by Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court. That's what government officials do. So their function is implementation and regulation. So why bureaucracy? So Max Weber, he's a famous sociologist from the 19th and 20th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th, and he stated that, or he emphasized the importance of the bureaucracy in getting things done, and he believed that a well-organized, rational bureaucracy is key to the successful operation of modern societies. So really, it's the best way to get things done in an uncorrupted way, in theory. That's why we have bureaucracy, because it simply works. And it's modeled after the government itself. It has a hierarchical structure, and we'll go into that in a second here, certain characteristics of bureaucracies. But really, they exist because it's believed that this is the best and most efficient way to get certain things done in society. The federal bureaucracy in the United States, it started in 1789, and the first department was the Department of State, and the Department of Treasury that existed as well. We also saw the Department of War that existed at that point in time, and it later turned into the Department of Defense. The newest department is the Department of Homeland Security, and that was founded in 2002 following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So over time, particularly, let's say in the 20th century, we've seen the growth of the welfare state and of the national security bureaucracy. The welfare state, this state that addresses social and economic problems, it didn't begin at this point, but it really ballooned during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. The national security bureaucracy, that ballooned with the with the wake of terrorist attacks and terrorism in the world. So the bureaucracy, again, it's about welfare of U.S. citizens through social and economic policy, implementation of policy that might help people through these welfare programs, and it's also about surveillance. Again, according to Max Weber, famous sociologist, he outlines some characteristic of bureaucracies, throughout the world, not just in America, but characteristics of all bureaucracies. And one thing that we see is a hierarchical authority structure. So the chain of command is hierarchical, and the top bureaucrat has ultimate control, and authority flows from top to bottom. So if we look at the federal bureaucracies at the very top, tippity top, that would be the president. But really the top would be the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Agriculture in whichever department. And underneath that, then the bureaucrats would implement what the head honcho of the department states. But really the top of that would be the president. So the president may strategize with those in his cabinet. Again, these are these 15 heads of each department. He can strategize with them. They can decide how they want to implement certain policies. And then that secretary of XYZ, then they go to their bureaucrats below them and decide how they're going to implement certain policies. But it all starts at the top. So you have the top, and then underneath there's more and more people. It's in this sort of pyramid shape, like many hierarchies that we see. Second characteristic is task specialization. So there's a clear division of labor in which every individual has a specialized job. Extensive rules, third. So we've heard about bureaucratic red tape, I'm sure. And these extensive rules, it's clearly written, well-established formal rules that all people in the organization follow. Clear goals, a clearly defined set of goals that all people in the organization strive toward. The merit principle, merit-based hiring and promotion, no granting of jobs to friends or family unless they are the best qualified. So people are, when they're hired hired based on their ability. They're not hired based on the fact that they know so-and-so, and then that's how they get the job. So there's a very impersonal way of hiring bureaucrats. So that leads to the last characteristic here, impersonality. And that's job performance is judged by productivity or how much work the individual gets done. So it's not about you as a person, it's about how you function in the role you're meant to function in. So there's some differences between bureaucracies or government agencies and private organizations, such as a regular company. And so bureaucracies or governmental agencies, they have more constraints by law. They're reliant on Congress and the president, and they have quite a few checks and balances that other organizations don't, that aren't interconnected or part of the government. And one is duplication. So that means that various agencies have similar roles or that they share with other agencies. And that's a way to maybe make sure that the job gets done a certain way, or if it's done well in one way by one organized or by one agency and not by the other, it's not going to fall through the cracks, and the work will get done in the way that it needs to. Or they can sort of double check to make sure that it's happening in the right way and sort of keep each other honest. Another thing too, there's a certain authorization of funds and appropriation that comes by Congress. So there's not unlimited funds, and there's no profit motive. Hearings as part of oversight, so Congress can have hearings, or the president as well, and decide if they want to change their strategy in certain agencies or departments. And Congress can completely rewrite legislation as well. If you're curious about how to work for the bureaucracy, most bureaucrats, they're hired via usajobs.gov. Unless you're in the military, you can get recruited by the military or join in that way. That's an entirely different ball game. But if you go to usajobs.gov, you can see a list of all of the various vacancies for the U.S. government and how to become a bureaucrat. And you can see the process or the qualifications as well that are required to work for various agencies and what their department requires. However, the cabinet is appointed by the president. So each head of the department, they're appointed by the president and then confirmed by Congress. So throughout most of the 1800s and the late 1700s as well, the U.S. operated under a system called the spoils system. And this is where various positions within the bureaucracy were given to those that were loyal to the president, or loyal to the president, or had some sort of personal connection. This is also called patronage. And so again, this saying, it's not what you know, it is who you know. So this is how the U.S. functioned for much of its history, really, until the early 20th century. And the bureaucracy hired people based increasingly more on their merit. So we have the spoils system, and then we have meritocracy. And today the bureaucracy functions or hires people based on their merit. It functions as a meritocracy. The spoils system is over. However, one can debate how true that is totally, but the government strives to be totally free of patronage and instead emphasizes merit. So these are the 15 departments within the federal bureaucracy and the various dates that they, or the years that they started. So I encourage you to pause the video and look at each department here and which year that they started. So most departments, 9 out of 15, started after 1900. And before, so there was only 6 departments up until 1900. And after 1900, they became more focused on so-called welfare, looking at the social and economic health and capabilities of U.S. citizens. And then later it became focused on veteran affairs and homeland security. And throughout most of the 1900s, again, the bureaucracy expanded in a way that was fairly bipartisan, meaning that both Republicans and Democrats expanded the federal bureaucracy since 1900. So what are some of the negatives about a bureaucracy or some complaints that people have. So these are the most common complaints that Americans have about the bureaucracy. One, there's a lot of red tape. Again, this bureaucratic red tape. So there's the maze of government rules, regulations, and paperwork, and it makes the government so overwhelming to citizens that many people try to avoid any contact. So a lot of people say they want absolutely nothing to do with the government or having them involved in their personal affairs. Conflict. So some agencies that often work at cross purposes with one another. So think about what might be an example of this. So we could look at an environmental agency might have conflict with the Department of Agriculture in a way. So we might want to expand farmland or farm in a certain way, but this might be at odds with the agenda of certain environmental bureaucrats. Duplication, so this was part of the checks and balance system, where some agencies have overlapping responsibilities or the same responsibilities. This is something that people complain about too, because it just seems redundant that people are doing work twice that doesn't need to be done twice. Unchecked growth, the tendency of agencies to grow unnecessarily and for the cost to escalate proportionately. So often these agencies, they're not getting smaller, they're getting bigger, and they may become less efficient over time as well. But then they still cost the same amount of money, or they cost even more as they are growing. And that leads to waste, so that's spending more on products and or services than is necessary. So how do we make sure that bureaucrats are using funds in an appropriate way that isn't wasteful? And lack of accountability. So this is another issue. So if these bureaucratic agencies are being wasteful, and people see that, it's difficult to fire or demote an incompetent bureaucrat. So it's difficult for those within their specific agency to be fired after a certain point. And this inefficiency can just continue, and no one has much power to do anything about it. And it's, in a way, we could argue that that's unfair to the American citizenry as a whole, because they vote certain people in, and their voice is heard, and they want certain policies enacted. But then when it gets to the bureaucracy, it might not be done right or well, or the way that the American people envision it, simply because there may be incompetent people working there, or just a lot of red tape, or the policy just gets sort of lost in the shuffle. And the American people really can't do much about it. They don't really have much say what's going on in each individual agency. They can vote in or out people in Congress, and they can vote in a president who they hope appoints people into the cabinet that represent what the people want as well. But what happens in the bureaucracies is kind of done behind closed doors, and we don't really get to have much say in how their procedure and policy works in each individual place. And as time goes on, often bureaucracies become self-serving. So they start off with the goal to address a certain issue. So, for example, we can look at agriculture. So the Department of Agriculture, that's meant to address certain things within the agricultural sector in the nation. And people working there, they may be very efficient to make sure certain things get done as they need to get done. But over time, the agency, instead of focusing on helping the agricultural sector, it starts to look at ways to make sure that it continues to exist as an agency. So it's more about keeping the agency working and functioning and lasting and job security than it is about servicing those who one is meant to help within that agency. So that's another potential downside to bureaucracies, or a critique that often comes up, that they become self-serving over time. So ask yourself this: can the government solve all of our problems? So if the federal bureaucracy exists to solve certain problems that we have in our society, social or economic ones, or even to keep the country safe and secure, what role does the government have in making those things happen? And can they solve all of these problems? The government often thinks that they can, and members of bureaucracies think that they can as well. So they're constantly, we could say, being busybodies, trying to think, oh, what's going on with society now? How can we implement certain policy that can solve a specific problem? Do you personally think the government can effectively do that? Some think yes, some think no, some think sort of to some extent. It's really an individual answer to this question. Can it solve all our problems? Can it solve some of our problems? Or maybe they can't, but potentially they're the best option that we have. So that's something to think about, where you stand on this particular question. I'll go through a series of political cartoons here that showcase how most people think of the federal bureaucracy. It's typically negative. We don't often hear positive remarks about bureaucracy in general. So this is an image from the 1930s, and it says the federal octopus. So it's sort of this creepy octopus that's taking money, and its tentacles are sort of reaching into every aspect of human society, of American society, of our individual lives. So each tentacle is sort of labeled. One says the Department of Agriculture Waste. Then they have the cost of bureaucracy, where this one tentacle is grabbing a bunch of money as well. So each department says waste on it. So it's this looming sort of sea monster that is encroaching into every aspect of our lives, and it's extremely wasteful. That was the view back in the 1930s. This is a pretty typical image that we'll see of a bureaucrat, stone face, sitting at a desk, and tons of paperwork. This image as well, pause and take a look at this one. Again, just papers flying all over the place. The rule of the desk. Any secretaries and clerks that work within governmental agencies. Rule of the desk again. This is making fun of the inefficiency of bureaucracies, that you may do all this work to get certain documents, and then at the end you're just gonna throw it away anyways. So it's a lot of running around and busy work that doesn't necessarily lead to effective or efficient outcomes. That's one of the primary critiques about the bureaucracy. Again, papers flying everywhere, a guy sitting at the desk. This image shows that within a bureaucracy, as we stated, it's a very hierarchical institution or organization, and those at the top tend to blame those below them, is what this cartoon is suggesting. So at the very bottom, you're going to have a multitude of so-called peons that have to take orders from those above them. But if anything goes wrong, those at the top, they point their fingers down the chain of command to the point where the one with the least power or influence is the one that gets blamed. Similar sort of image that we see. Someone wants to get something done, they go to a bureaucrat, and what we get is often a bunch of scrutiny and not necessarily anything getting done, because the paper will just go into the stack of other papers. Here are some quotes that we've seen. So Albert Einstein, he said, "Bureaucracy is the death of all sound work." So just think about each of these quotes and whether or not you agree with them or not, or maybe they're potentially a bit too harsh to be taken seriously. And consider why they say this. Why are they saying these things about bureaucracy? Just think of the social and historical context that goes around this, that surrounds this disdain for bureaucracy. Mary McCarthy, she stated, bureaucracy, the rule of no one, has become the modern form of despotism. So despotism is authoritarian rule. And she's essentially saying that through the federal bureaucracy, we lose a lot of our political power. And the rule of no one, because you can't really see who's ruling you. It's this behind the scenes bureaucratic rule that we all must sort of abide by. Eugene McCarthy, the only thing that saves us from bureaucracy is its inefficiency, and efficient bureaucracy is the greatest threat to freedom. So why would bureaucracy be a threat to freedom? Think about that. And this is sort of a dual insult. He says bureaucracies are notoriously inefficient. He says bureaucracy is the only thing that saves us from bureaucracy is its inefficiency. For the bureaucrat, the world is a mere object to be manipulated by him. Karl Marx stated that. So again, this draws us to this statement that bureaucracies are meant to solve social problems. So if bureaucracies are constantly looking at society as maybe an object, like Marx says, then it's not necessarily one to be manipulated, but one to be manipulated or molded in a way, or fixed, to look at as though maybe there are problems that the society has, and bureaucrats can solve those problems in some way. So is the federal bureaucracy a liberal or conservative invention? So as we stated earlier, there's been agencies or departments created by both parties. It's not simply just Democrats or Republicans that create bureaucratic departments or agencies within the government. But if we look at it ideologically speaking, contemporary liberalism suggests that the government can and should intervene to adapt to social problems, and it should be there to help with social problems. So in a sense, the federal bureaucracy is more liberal than it is conservative if we look at it just from an ideological standpoint. Conservatives, though, traditionally, they look at the government's function as ensuring that there is morality in the citizenry, and also that there is a strong military defense. So it's ideologically speaking, again, we could say that it's both. So on one hand, the bureaucracy on the liberal side is meant to ensure that social issues are solved and that the government plays a role in that. But then on the conservative side, the bureaucracy is used to promote national security and defense. So some more sort of cultural critiques of the federal bureaucracy. So there are many jokes about how government workers are inefficient. So often we hear this, well, they're working for the government, so of course nothing's going to get done. So that's this sort of joke that we often hear in the media or just from regular people. I know I've heard that. The show Futurama, there's one character on there, Hermes. He is a bureaucrat, and one funny quote on there was from some random character that works in a bureaucracy. He said, "Congratulations indeed, but you finished with 2 seconds to spare, so I'm demoting you. A good bureaucrat never finishes early." So that's again stating too that bureaucrats, they aren't efficient, they don't get things done. A good bureaucrat must never finish early. So this critique though of bureaucracies, this isn't America specific, it happens around the world. There's a Russian quote, "Пойди туда, не знаю куда. Принеси то, не знаю что." So it means go there, I don't know where, bring that, I don't know what. So if one goes to a bureaucrat they might tell you to go get something, but they don't know where you need to get it, and they want you to bring something as well, but they don't know what it is even that you need to bring. It's this sort of bureaucratic scramble there's this significant amount of red tape where one has to do all of these things, bring required documents, sign in specific places, but the bureaucrat may not know what it is that you even need to bring. And if any of you have read Franz Kafka's The Castle, this is a book that sort of touches on bureaucracy as well. And there's a character who is trying to get to the top of the castle. I'm not entirely sure why. And as to get up there, he goes from one person or agency to another, trying to get to the top, and he just gets getting sent from one place to the next. And it's this critique of bureaucracies that, again, they often are making you run all over the place for things, and you don't know where you're going or how to get to where you need to go. It's wildly inefficient. Again, that's sort of the conclusion that many make about bureaucracies and why they critique it. So how successful has the federal bureaucracy been? Well, it employs many people, so that's one good thing. The United States does have an incredibly successful military, and there has been welfare success where, so-called welfare, where people do get help from the government when they need it. So if you can get through the red tape and all the rules and procedures, sometimes some successful outcomes can arise from it. So the bureaucracy is not entirely bad, but it does get a bad rap. So we'll end things here with a question and something for you to consider yourself. So how big should the government be? And how much government involvement is too much? Maybe no amount is too much. That may be what you think. So we all have a different idea about how much government involvement there should be in our personal lives and how big the government should be. So as I stated, we have about 3 million bureaucrats and 535 members of Congress, 17 members of the executive branch. So we can say there's millions of people in the government. Is that too big? Are there too many agencies? Or is there not enough? Maybe the government is simply not big enough and we need more government action. That's really for you to decide. Again, the federal bureaucracy, this is a so-called fourth branch of government or an extension of the second branch of government. And they have a variety of different powers and things that they do, but their primary objective is to implement policies and laws that are enacted by Congress and to make sure that things actually get done.